you all to stand. If you know this, please feel free to fully. Velinamanoai kalegualoha aloha tuahine mailuahine aiwaikiki kia ike kahaukani kanino na leo eo kamaina aina aloha Manoae. And wapa'i to claps. Mahalo.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the WGSS American Studies and Ethnic Studies Joint Monthly Colloquium. We're so happy that you can join us today for some refreshments, for some community, and to learn from our Dr. Vallin. Before I begin, I want to shout out Joyce Mariano and Ethan Caldwell, with whom I co-organized these colloquiums. And I also want to shout out our wonderful GAs, Loki, Soyan, Hannah. They tirelessly work for our department to help set up our events, clean up our events. Quinn also for many years is first. We couldn't do what we do without you guys. So I just want to say thank you. So let's see. I have the beautiful. Oh, hold on. We have we have another colloquium coming up next month. We are doing the book launch for Seeds of Change for Monique Marnesco on April 17th. And we will have books available to sign and to purchase there. So please join us for that event. Okay, now I have the wonderful job of introducing Dr. Vallin. Let me be official here. Dr. Vallin's research focuses on pedagogical practices that foster inclusive and affirming teaching and learning as they apply to the sex education classroom. She questions the role of primary public sex education cross-culturally and has researched students' sex education experiences in her native Sweden and here in the US. She is also active and committed to our community, where she consults and teaches sex education in K-12 setting. All of this, of course, is very true. But I think one of the most important things to say about Dr. Vallin is that she is the heart of our department. Many of our students will say, and they will say it first, that they are our major, certificate, minor, or they're taking this class because they had such a, doesn't say that word, good time in Dr. Vallin's class, right? She brings students in with her mind-blowing, right, intelligence, intellect, but also her warmth and her presence. And you can always feel that she's connecting and she wants to just do better for you and for our community. And this is so true for our faculty as well, right? She's the one that will always show up and do what she says she's going to do, which, you know, is a big thing, a big quality in a faculty member and a coworker. And I think all of this, we can see this in this room. Not only is it packed, but it's packed with her current students, her former students, right? People have ridden on airplanes to be here today. And all of this is because of everything that you've given our community. And so we're so grateful to learn from you today and hear from you about some of this magic that you're able to create in the classroom. So join me in welcoming Dr. Vallin.
All right, do this. What are you doing to me? Okay, let's do this. Hello, my kako.
Aloha.
Mahalo I ke ea hui ana. O Lisa Valin, ku'ui inoa. No Lidköping Sverige, my all. Hello, everyone. It is truly a joy for me to be here. My name is Lisa Valin, and I'm originally from Lidköping, Sweden. Mahalo alohi for that lovely Ole Kahea. Aloe is our latest GA recruit to our WGSS GA team, and she is just a pure pleasure. I have the opportunity to work with her this semester, and it is so inspiring. So thank you again. Also, thank you, Dr. Lee, for that heartfelt introduction. I still feel like I'm vibrating. I need to just take a minute. I'm beyond fortunate to call you as a colleague and a coworker. I'm always so supportive and enthusiastic about my work. And to be completely honest, it is really because of her I am standing here right now. She's the one who roped me in to do this.
Yeah.
So, it's on her. And lastly, thanks to all of you for being here, like both in person and those for you who are in Zoom. Hello, even my mom and dad from Sweden, my brother. Right. Thank you so much. I mean, it's so humbling that you all took the time, especially on a Friday afternoon. Like, I feel like we all have better things to do. But it is really means so much that you are all here to support me. It's been a minute since I've given a formal talk like this, so you all need to bear with me. My talk is titled Pedagogical Practices in Sexuality Studies, Rethinking Norms and Celebrating Sexual Diversity. But before I begin to talk about my pedagogy, theory, and practice, I want to begin with something that I consider essential to sexuality studies, and that is transparency. Teaching about sex and sexuality is not abstract work. It is intimate, it is lived, it is political. And because of that, I believe that whenever we enter these conversations, whether it's a classroom or whether it's like a formal colloquium like this, I owe you a sense of who I am and how I arrived here. So I'd like to begin by sharing a bit about myself, my training, my path into this work, and what has shaped me as an educator. All right. As I mentioned, I was born and raised in Lidköping, the small town in the southern parts of Sweden. Growing up in Sweden during the 1980s and 90s meant being shaped by a society deeply influenced by social democratic visions of leaders like Olof Palme, a vision rooted in equality, strong public institutions, and collective responsibility. Those cultural values certainly shaped how I came to think about power, fairness, and who gets to belong. Cultural curiosity is what eventually brought me to the United States. After high school, I came here to pursue higher education, and I earned a bachelor's degree in geography, focusing on the human environment. At the time, I imagined I might work for the United Nations. I had always been very fascinated by culture, particularly how communities make meaning of identity, belonging, and difference. So as an undergraduate, I enrolled in a GE course in sexuality studies, and that course changed the trajectory of my learning and ultimately my future career. This course in sexuality studies was taught by Anne Olive, and she had this extraordinary ability to command a large classroom while remaining warm, precise, and deeply human. She taught sex and sexuality in a way that felt urgent and relevant, and you felt seen in her classroom. After completing the course, I became her learning assistant. I worked alongside her for the remaining of the 2 years of my undergraduate degree, helped in her classes, setting up computer, handing out papers, supporting students' questions. And with Anne's encouragement, I completed a master's degree in sexuality studies. And these 2 years were the most formative in terms of figuring out what I wanted to do career-wise. It became clear to me that despite sexuality being such a central part to our human life, not everyone is afforded the opportunity to be affirmed and celebrated in who they are as sexual beings. Like Anne, I wanted to be part of changing that. I later pursued a PhD here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in educational psychology, where I studied cultural trauma and pedagogy, asking what it means to teach sexuality responsibly and what it means to receive this delicate knowledge as a student. I began teaching with the WIGS department. We call ourselves WIGS because it's hard to do WGS, so the WIGS. So the WIGS department shortly after arriving here in 2010. And today I serve as instructional faculty and undergraduate chair, devoted fully to teaching, like the dream job. It's amazing. I have the privilege of working in a department that deeply supports and encourages my work. I couldn't ask for better colleagues. Dr. Koikari, Dr. Ferguson, Dr. Saraswati, Dr. Lee, Dr. Dasgupta, and our steadfast leader, Dr. Lani Tevis. What a dream team we are. But I'll need to return to Anne because I would not be standing here without her. I want to spend a few moments highlighting why strong mentorship is foundational to pedagogical practice. It is hard for me to talk about Anne Weeman Olive without getting emotional. She wasn't just a mentor, she was a true role model, a steady presence in my life, both inside and outside of the classroom. And she lived an extraordinary life. She always used to say, my life is a series of beautiful people passing through it. But the truth is that she was that beautiful person passing through so many of ours. She came into my life at a time when I was deeply in sort of need of finding my people. I was an international student from Sweden, living on my own with all my family back home. And Anne took me under her wing. She nurtured me, not just as a student, but as a person. And that kind of mentorship changes you. It's been 10 years since Anne passed away. And while she no longer is with us, her pedagogy, her way of teaching, still very much is. I share about Anne because mentorship is not peripheral to pedagogy. It is central to it. Anne was originally a registered nurse before returning to San Francisco State. She came back to higher education because she was concerned about the lack of understanding around sexuality, especially within the health fields. She believed that biology had done a lot of harm in the way it framed sexuality, and she wanted to fix this. In the late 1970s, she offered one of the first sexuality studies courses in the United States. She taught sexuality as an integrative science, offering nuanced and expansive perspectives on the diversity of our sexual bodies. That first semester, nearly 700 students filled McKenna Theater at SFSU. Her courses quickly became immensely popular, and over the course of her career, she taught more than 36,000 students. Like 36,000, that's like a small town. I got a lot of people. But what made Anne extraordinary was not only the scale, it was how she taught. Whoa. She approached sexuality studies with an immense joy and passion, and she refused to center shame and fear. Sexuality education too often begins with fear, with disease, danger, morality. And though Anne understood trauma, she did not let trauma define sexuality. She began with possibility. She replaced stigma with knowledge and with humor. She has such a great sense of humor. And I have to say, like standing in front of her, oftentimes up on a stage, in front of hundreds of students, this wise, grandma-like figure. I mean, she taught up until the late 70s. And she was up there teaching the science behind orgasm, erection, and the power of the clitoris. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. So inviting and just like validating. She taught sexuality as something that mattered beyond the classroom. And for Anne, the classroom was never isolated from the community. It was preparation for it. Whether she was explaining immune system functioning to better understand STIs, the physiological response of sexual behaviors, gametogenesis, or sexual differentiation, she always made clear why this knowledge was socially and ethically urgent. She was also a fierce activist and a brave thinker. When the HIV epidemic devastated San Francisco in the early 1980s, she did not retreat into abstraction. Together with Cleve Jones and Dr. Marcus Conant, she helped establish the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, which continues to serve over 25,000 people annually in the Bay Area. She chaired the committee that wrote the California State University AIDS policy, ensuring protection and access for individuals living with HIV and AIDS. Anne believed that education should extend far beyond the classroom. She encouraged her students to engage directly with the community through volunteer work, internships, attending conferences, participating in workshops, listening to emerging research, and presenting their own alongside scholars and activists. My first conference was the International AIDS Conference in Mexico City in 2008. And that was fully possible because of Anne's mentorship and her funding. And possibilities like that, like attending an international conference as an undergraduate student, that wasn't incidental, that was intentional on her behalf. And perhaps that is what influenced me the most about her, was that she mentored intentionally. I worked in Anne's office every day, and sometimes even on the weekends, like anywhere she went, I was like, you need me? Like, I'll right? I observed her teach, we debriefed after class, we refined content, assignments, PowerPoint slides, and at one point I was tasked with transferring her course materials from overhead transparencies like this machine here, like the overheads, and a slide projector, the carousels into digital formats, and actually put one on there because I don't know if everyone knows about this ancient machine. That's like a slide carousel. But those slides were remarkable. They held not only decades of knowledge, but also a tremendous amount of intention. Each slide has a limited space, which meant that you have to be very thoughtful about how to present things. The physical labor of creating, or rather correcting a slide was not easy. It required, again, real labor, typing transparencies, arranging physical slides, carefully organizing them inside of that carousel. And oh my gosh, if you messed up one, you had to redo the entire thing. Oh my God, labor, people, labor. But that manual process created these natural moments of reflections. As I worked through materials spanning from the 1970s up to the early 2000s, I had to slow down because the labor required it. I had to examine every slide, and then later with Anne, we talked about, what was working, what was not working, what should be transferred, and what should go. And for me, that process was incredibly enriching. It allowed me to see that intentionality behind teaching is in a very tangible way. And in many ways, it offered something that I think can be harder to find today in our currently very digital world. The time to spend, to take the pause, to take time to reflect, and to carefully think about how we present the knowledge that we present. We discussed what landed, what didn't. I learned that pedagogy is not subject mastery alone. It is not recitation, it's reflection, it's revision, it's responsibility. And later, when I encountered the work of renowned Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, who was by far my most favorite inspirational sources for pedagogical practices, particularly her vision on engaged pedagogy and what it means to teach with love. I found language for what I had been already witnessing in Anne's classroom. Hooks reminds us that language can be a practice of freedom, one rooted in care, accountability, and transformation. Her work on transformative and restorative approaches to education deeply shaped how I understand the classroom, not as a site of control, but as a space of possibility. Anne shared that vision, the vision of understanding the classroom as a place of possibility. She poured her heart and soul into her teaching, and every single student mattered to her. One of the reasons why we taught such high enrolled courses was because she was adamant about anyone who wants a place in our classroom should have one, because there are so few opportunities for students to learn about sexuality studies in an academic setting. So that's the lineage that I come from, right? If I teach with joy, it's because Anne did. If I teach with urgency, like it matters, that's the way she taught, right? And if I believe that mentorship is foundational to pedagogical practice, it's because I lived it. Strong mentorship is not about producing replicas. It's about cultivating educators who understand that teaching sexuality is community work. Universities do not exist outside of the communities that surround them. We are embedded in social systems, public health systems, cultural systems, and histories. Sexuality studies, perhaps more than many disciplines, is shaped by what happens beyond the classroom. Knowledge in this field is not produced solely in academic journals. It is co-produced with activists, public health practitioners, harm reduction specialists, community organizers, and cultural leaders. If we are preparing students to understand sexuality responsibly, we must prepare them for life beyond the classroom, where what they learn has real consequences for real bodies and real communities. For over a decade, I have cultivated partnerships with our courses and our community organizations. And these are not one-time guest appearances that you see up here. They are ongoing relationships. Our community educators return year after year because, again, expertise do not live only within university settings. When harm reduction specialists like Hima Lekadena speak about HIV prevention, when David Khalili brings in his work as a sex therapist, when Brina Gasco talks about STI testing and tracing, when Eric Martinez connects sexuality studies to K-12 education, when Jordan Renfro speaks to students about sexual violence and abuse, and when Dr. Chandini Raidu shares her work in reproductive care, students aren't just receiving information, they're witnessing applied expertise. They're seeing theory in motion. And I want to take a minute to pause here, also so I can catch a breath, because I'm still like, But I really want to take a minute to pause here to recognize two people who are actually here with us today, and that is Kiva Lekadena from and Dr. Chandani Raju right there in the middle. I first met Kiva after I arrived here in Hawaii, shortly after I arrived here. I began teaching a course called WDSS, Bio 350, Sex Services and the Life Cycle in the spring of 2011. And that course, at least the way I teach it, deeply resembles Anne's legacy and her teaching philosophy. But when I first began teaching this course, I didn't have any connections to our local community. I just arrived. And so when I taught back in San Francisco, I had inherited many of Anne's relationships, but now I needed to sort of forge these on my own. So I did some research and I reached out to what was then known as Life Foundation. Today that is known as Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. And in the spring of 2012, Kiva came to share about HIV care and prevention. And like Anne, Kiva has this remarkable ability to connect with students and seamlessly translate why learning about HIV matters. She shares this knowledge, not just information, but through stories, through lived experience, and with a deeply human perspective that helps students see the real people and communities behind the science. Students often mention Kiva in their course evaluations as the highlight of the semester. Another remarkable thing about Kiva, and trust there are many, is her longstanding commitment to our students. Since that first visit in the spring of 2012, Kiva has made it a priority to return every single semester, every single semester, every fall, every summer, every spring, summer, fall. Yeah, right. She's meeting with our students both in person, and then she has extra sessions online to continue these conversations about HIV prevention, care, and harm reduction. For nearly 15 years, she's been a part of our students' learning experience. And that level of dedication to education and community partnership is truly extraordinary. Kiva's impact goes beyond the classroom. Through her connections, students have been introduced to community organizing, volunteer internships, even full-time employment. One of our former students now works full-time for the Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. And also thanks to Kiva, our class, the 350 class, began making annual appearances at the Honolulu AIDS Walk, where we show up together as a class to support the community and to understand that sexuality studies not only is something we learn in class, but we practice that through solidarity and through presence. Now, Dr. Chandani Raju shares a very similar story in terms of commitment and dedication. Chandani and I met 10 years ago in the spring of 2016 when we were both students in a WIGS graduate seminar taught by our very own, where are you, Dr. Saraswati? Yes, right. It was a course called Feminism and Its Others. At the time, and as a fellow classmate, I didn't realize that Chandani was already Dr. Raju in practicing obstetric gynecologist. There were certainly hints in our class discussion that she had deep knowledge of biological sciences, but I didn't really get the full scope of her clinical expertise. Now knowing Chandani, I am not surprised at all that she was in that class. Despite an impressive level of expertise and competence, she continues to seek opportunities to expand her knowledge in ways to better support her practice. And that curiosity and commitment to learning are very much part of who she is. Someone who has made it her life's work to ensure that her knowledge and skills support and improve community health. We quickly bonded over a shared belief in the use of education as a tool to improve people's sexual health. And ever since that semester, Dr. Raju, like Kiva, has been a steady presence in for our students. Every single semester, spring, summer, fall, she makes an appearance, despite busy clinical schedules, to ensure that she comes to our students. Her contributions are invaluable. We often joke that Dr. Raju, she's like that kind of doctor. Like, I'm not that kind. Like, I don't have that medical experience, right? Students are so deeply appreciative of her work. Through Chandani's mentorship, students have had opportunities to pursue clinical shadowing, participating in research projects, and receive guidance as they apply to medical and health professional programs, opportunities that truly can be transformative. So again, Kiva and Chandani, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the commitment to bridging the classroom with community. Pedagogical practice in sexuality studies is not something produced by one individual. It truly takes a community. And together, we have reached more than 10,000 students. It's not 36 like Anne, right? We'll get there, trust. Yeah, we'll get there. So thank you again so much. Now, when community makes its way into the classroom, students see firsthand that sexuality studies is not abstract. It's relational, it's accountable. And that accountability means more than simply inviting community into the classroom. It means translating theory into practice, not as add-ons, but as pedagogical commitments. A commitment to ensure that the communities we work with are reflected in the content we teach, in the examples we use, and in the questions we ask. Because when we are accountable to community, we must ensure that the knowledge produced do not erase the very people we claim to understand. That accountability extends further. If we're accountable to the communities around us, we must also be accountable to the narratives that we produce. Now, it's important to acknowledge that there are many narratives about the sexual body that have been produced across cultures and histories. And I'm not suggesting here at all that there's been one universal way of understanding sex and sexuality. Rather, I'm speaking specifically about a narrative that emerges from Western scientific thought, an intellectual tradition in which I myself was trained. And within that tradition, narratives about sexuality have often centered a very particular body, a body presumed to be white, heterosexual, cisgendered, and oriented towards reproduction. This body became the unspoken reference point against which all other bodies are measured, studied, and often judged. And within that framework, diversity does not appear as variation, it appears as deviation. And few narratives have been more powerful or as limiting as the binary framing of biology, of the body in biology. So I want to begin with something that may feel obvious, so obvious that we rarely interrogate it. But let's look at these symbols here, the circle with the cross and the circle with the arrow. We commonly recognize these symbols as either female or male, and we encounter them in many places, like textbooks, public markers, medical forums, research articles, often without giving them much thought, as if they were neutral, objective notations of female and male. But they're not neutral. These symbols did not emerge from biology alone. They are shaped through mythology, astronomy, alchemy, botany, and later absorbed into the human biological classification during a period deeply entangled with European colonial expansion and racial hierarchy. Over time, these symbols were infused with meaning. In classical antiquity, beginning around the 5th century before Common Era, the planets Venus and Mars were mythological figures. Venus was associated with beauty and love, and Mars with war and strength. These were cultural narratives about femininity and masculinity long before they became biological shorthand. By medieval and early modern periods, roughly between the 1st and 17th centuries, alchemy linked these planetary symbols to metals. Venus, as it was associated with copper, a softer, more malleable metal, while Mars was linked to iron, harder and more rigid. And just like a little side note right here, like that little bottle you see there with the little copper flakes, that's a small bottle that I brought back from one of my trip back home to Sweden. I actually have 2 Swedes in the audience too. Right, where are you? There you are in the front. Yes, Swedish international students. Right, I love it. Right, so they know what I'm talking about here, right? So they are from Falu Koppargruva, or the Falu copper mine, which is a site that was for centuries a very central part to Sweden's economy and national identity. And the pigment that's derived from the copper is what has become that iconic deep red that you see on some of our houses, and you still see them today. So cultural markers that's still endures. Anyway, already metaphor and cultural meaning were being layered onto materials that would later be folded into biological symbolism. And check this out, another Swede, Carl Linnaeus, in 1735, Carl Linnaeus, we call him Carl von Linné, published Systema Naturia, introducing what he called the sexual system of plant classification. He borrowed these planetary symbols to denote male and female reproductive structures in plants. But Linnaeus did something more complex than is often known. He also included a third notation. which was Mercury. Mercury represented what he described as the perfect plant. Hermaphroditic flowers containing both reproductive organs and capable of self-fertilization. In botanical classification, that was not a defect, that was the completeness. During the 18th and 19th centuries, when these symbols moved from botany into emerging medical fields to classify human biology, Enlightenment science expanded alongside European colonial projects. Systems of classification did more than organize plants, they began to organize people. As modern medicine and biology took shape, human sex categories became increasingly anchored in reproduction. Sexuality was framed as something potentially destabilizing, something that needed to be regulated. Social order depended on clear binary distinctions, and reproduction became the defining criterion of proper sex. These classification systems did not exist in isolation. They developed within broader colonial logics that sought to categorize, rank, and control populations. Scientific taxonomies were used to legitimize hierarchies, not only for sex, but for race, civilization, and normalcy. French philosopher Michel Foucault described this shift as the emergence of biopolitics, a form of power concentrated not simply with ruling territory, but with the governing of life itself. Bodies became sites of measurement, classification, and regulation. Binary sex classification aligned neatly with these logics: fixed categories, measurable differences, and clear boundaries. Bodies that did not conform, whether through intersex variations, gender diversity, or culturally distinct understandings of sex, were increasingly pathologized, regulated, or even erased. So the symbols, which we still often treat as simple biological notations, are not objective truths. They are historical constructions shaped within Western traditions that position themselves as universal, authoritative, and scientifically neutral. Following the binary classification, I want to examine the language that we use to describe the sexual body. Language that emerged largely through European anatomical science, most often produced by white, male physicians, anatomists, and even priests working within Western institutions of power. So let's look at some names for some anatomical structures. How about this one? The fallopian tubes, named after 16th century Italian anatomist and Catholic priest, Gabriele Fallopio. The Cooper glands, named after Dr. William Cooper, a 17th century English surgeon. And this one, I know. The so-called G-spot, named after German physician Ernst Grafenberg in the 20th century. Now, to be fair, Ernst himself did not name this after himself. Yeah, like it wasn't, you can't hate on him, like that wasn't his fault. The term was coined by American physician Frank Diego in 1981 in reference to Dr. Grafenberg's research, particularly his research around the urethra in response to orgasm. Now, what I find fascinating with these anatomical structures are that they're named after individuals who documented them rather than by their structure or function. Like where's the Vallin spot? Like what? Nuts, right? And I also feel like that's like an impressive level of confidence, yeah? Like you're naming a human body part after yourself. For generations to come, your name is immortalized in the human body. Like serious branding privileges. But unfortunately for Fallopio and the rest, today it is not uncommon to use more descriptive terminology when referring to sexual anatomy. So instead of the fallopian tubes, we note the oviducts or the uterine tubes, which are muscular structures that transport an ovum from the ovary to the uterus. Instead of the Cooper gland, we say vulva-urethra glands. These are the glands that produce pre-ejaculatory fluids or pre-cum, to help lubricate the glands of the penis or protect the urethra. And the G-spot, which is actually not a distinct organ. It refers rather to an area of erectile tissue along the anterior vaginal wall, about 2 inches in to the vaginal canal, press upwards towards the urethra. This area, when stimulated, may contribute to sexual pleasure. And turns out that stimulating the G-spot is a superb way to stimulate the clitoris, which is by far my favorite organ. We have to have like a whole, like they did in a statue. Like I want that statue, like brilliant. Thankfully, the clitoris was not named after European priest or anatomist. Yay. The word clitoris comes from 17th century modern Latin, derived from Greek kleitoris, possibly related to kleien, meaning to shut or enclose, probably referencing the clitoral glands that are partially covered by the clitoral hood, as we can see up here, yeah, and then the labia. Some scholars also have connected kleis, which means key, metamorphically to key to pleasure. Because unlike any other organ in the body, this sort of primary function of the clit is to produce pleasure. Like, I mean, why aren't we cheering for that? That's amazing. That is just a part of right, pleasure, right? So let's make sure we all know how to use it. Goodness. Naming is power. It centers discovery over embodiment. It subtly reinforces the idea that knowledge flows from the person who found it onto the body. Yeah? These subtle sort of ideas, right? It becomes very clearly also when we talk about hormones. For decades, and still today, we often hear testosterone described as a male hormone or estrogen as a female hormone. But biologically, that framing is inaccurate. There is no such thing as a male or a female hormone. All human bodies produce androgens and estrogens, just in varying concentrations, largely influenced by gonadal tissue and endocrine signaling. On average, testes tend to produce higher levels of androgens, and ovaries tend to produce higher levels of estrogens. But both hormones are present and necessary in all bodies. Testosterone, which is the most potent androgen, and estradiol 17 beta, which is the most potent estrogen, supports various functions in the body, such as bone density, cardiovascular health, brain function, muscle mass, metabolism, libido, and overall physiological regulation. So the difference is not in degree, the difference is in degree, not existence. Yet what has happened is the layering of sort of gendered meaning onto these biochemical processes, particularly in the way that they relate to the development of our secondary sexual characteristics. Estrogen is not femininity, and testosterone is not masculinity. They're hormones, right? Yes, higher levels of testosterone are associated with certain secondary sexual characteristics, such as increased muscle mass, voice deepening, facial and body hair growth, and changes in fat distribution. And yes, higher levels of estrogen are associated with breast development, fat redistribution, regulation and reproductive tissues, and bone maintenance. These are biological effects, but somewhere along the way, we moved from describing biological effects to using them as proof of who counts as a man or who counts as a woman. Biological variation became gendered evidence, and gendered evidence became hierarchy. At birth, we assign sex largely based on the appearance of external genitalia. That assignment does not measure chromosomes, hormone levels, receptor sensitivity, or future identity. It's a visual categorization. Gender, however, is distinct from biological sex. Gender is one's own internal sense of self, shaped through embodiment, development, culture, and lived experience. For some individuals, the secondary sexual characteristics that are influenced by, for example, testosterone, may feel very affirming, as those characteristics may support gender identity. But for many people, those same physiological processes may feel profoundly incongruent, producing a body that does not reflect the internal sense of self. And this experience is not only about how one feels in one's body, it's about how that body is perceived, because gender is not lived in isolation. It is socially recognized and affirmed, or misrecognized and neglected. The way others read our bodies, the pronouns they use, the assumptions they make, the categories they place us into, profoundly shapes how we move through the world and how we come to see and understand ourselves. For many trans and non-binary folks, the distress is not simply about physical characteristics. It's about the constant demand to justify or explain one's gender in a society that treats certain embodiments as self-evidence and others as suspects. In some ways, it parallels other forms of social privilege, just as one who has never experienced racism may struggle to understand its daily weight. Someone whose gender has never been contested may not easily perceive the labor it requires to defend it. And that labor exists because, again, we treat biology as proof, because we have made hormones and their effects as stand-in evidence of who someone is supposed to be. Queer scholar Judith Butler's work on gender performativity profoundly influenced how I came to understand this distinction. Butler argues that gender is not something that we simply are, rather that it's something we repeatedly do. It is constituted through norms, language, recognition, and social repetition. And if gender is performative, sustained through repetition and recognition, then the binary is not an inevitable biological truth. It is a system maintained through cultural enforcement. It is socially sustained. Butler notes, to say that gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. In other words, there is no such thing as being inherently a man or a woman. Gender is produced through repeated actions, through norms, behaviors, language, and expectations that we enact over time. These patterns become so familiar and so socially reinforced that they begin to feel natural or innate. And that changes how we interpret biology. Sex hormones themselves are not the problem. The problem arises when we treat effects as destiny, when we assume that biology must dictate identity. Embedded in the assumptions is a second belief that hormone production should remain inherently fixed, that modifying hormone levels so one's physiology better corresponds with one's lived identity is somehow seen as unnatural and therefore ethically suspect or morally wrong. But biological function don't care about ethics or morality. Hormones regulate tissue development, metabolism, and reproduction. They don't carry moral intention. It is we who assign moral meaning to biological processes. Let's consider insulin. Insulin is a hormone. When someone has diabetes and their bodies cannot produce properly regulate insulin, we don't question whether insulin therapy is natural, right? We recognize it as necessary, compassionate, life-sustaining care, right? You don't get your insulin treatment, you're done, right? It's life-sustaining. But gender-affirming hormone therapy operates with that same biological logic. It works within the body's endocrine system to adjust hormone levels in a way that supports well-being. I'm talking about well-being that's also life-sustaining. Yes, this form of hormone carries often question. The objection then, it's not the hormonal intervention itself. It's about who is allowed to intervene and for what purpose. And that objection has real consequences. Hormones are not gendered. They are biochemical messengers. If we understood sex hormones simply as influencing secondary sexual characteristics rather than determining identity, we could separate physiology from gender. And that shift would allow us to approach gender-affirming care with empathy and precision instead of suspicion and neglect. It would allow us to better understand the use of hormone therapy, not as a becoming, but as supporting the embodiment of one's identity. Gender diversity is not a disruption of biology. It is a natural reflection of our great variation. It is Mercury. It is a possibility of complexity beyond the binary. And perhaps more importantly, in the context of pedagogy, this complexity allows us to teach students that biology does not dictate destiny. Bodies are diverse, hormones are dynamic, identities are lived. Now, if there's one thing that runs through all of my teaching, it is this. It's a sustained challenge to heteronormativity, the cultural assumption that heterosexuality is the default, that cis men and women are naturally opposite and complementary, and that gender only exists in two fixed forms. It's a disruption of the binary and a questioning of the system that compress human diversity into narrow boxes. Because at its core, sexuality studies is about questioning those boxes and examining systems of power, the frameworks that tells us who we are supposed to be. We are a studies, yeah? We are not an ology, and that distinction matters. It means that we don't treat knowledge as singular, fixed, or neutral. We recognize that what we know is shaped by interdisciplinary forces, by history, culture, science, politics, and by who has been granted the authority to define truth. Bay Area queer scholar and trans activist Mauro Cifuentes reminds us that when we work in sexuality studies, we work in truths. Truths with an S, right? And my greatest wish is that what my students will take away from the classroom is an understanding and appreciation of our diverse sexual truths. I want them to know that even though we are told our sex chromosomes are either XX or XY, and based on this, we are then born as a girl or born as a boy. And then depending on whether we are a girl or a boy, we're often then given a specific name, wear specific clothes, play with specific toys. We're like either that pink girl or the blue boy. Heteronormativity asks us to conform and to accept ourselves as either feminine or masculine, and finally to develop a heterosexual orientation. This is binary heteronormative thinking, which is deeply ingrained in our society. Just think about how many moments in everyday life that require us to fit into this binary. Birth records, medical forms, school enrollment forms, driver license, passport, marriage license, even our death certificates. We have built many of our institutions around the assumption that everyone is either cis heterosexual male or cis heterosexual female. But that assumption is not correct because it doesn't accurately reflect the complexity of our sexual bodies and life. Sexuality is diverse, whether we choose to recognize, affirm, and celebrate this, that's the fact. The rainbow has infinite colors for a reason, right? Like we are diverse. We don't all have XX or XY chromosomes. Some of us are alive and well with just a single X. This is known as Turner syndrome. Some may have an extra Y known as triple X or trisomy X. Or we might have XY chromosomes and then an additional X known as XXY or Klinefelter, or an extra Y known as extra Y syndrome. And there are many variations to our sex chromosomes. In contrary to popular belief, we are not born a boy or born a girl. We are assigned sex at birth as a boy or a girl. We have a wide variety of intersex conditions, right? And sometimes it's not possible to assign biological sex at birth. Sometimes intersex conditions result in what's referred to as ambiguous genitalia, though that ambiguity is just natural human variation, refusing to conform to binary assumptions about biological sex. Intersex conditions, there are about 30 to 40 intersex traits, are often more common than we like to think. They occur in about 1 to 400 or 1 to 1,000 live births, so about 1.7% of the human population. And though our society and culture are working hard to gender us into a pink girl and a blue boy, not all of us feel comfortable in these binary gender expectations. I mean, how many of you were tomboys or tomgirls growing up? Similarly, not everyone feels at home in cisgender identities. Again, the assumption that just because you've been assigned male at birth, raised as a boy, then you will also identify as a masculine man later. Some of us transgress this binary assumptions and naturally identify as trans or non-binary. And lastly, we're not all heterosexual. Some of us are lesbian, gay, bi, or pansexual, or asexual. Thank God we're not all straight, right? We don't all choose the straight lifestyle. That's my favorite. Like every time, those times we talk about homosexuality, like, oh, that homosexual lifestyle, right? But we don't do that with straight people. Oh, the heterosexual lifestyle, right? Like that's like we had a choice. And here's a quote from one of my classmates from the MA program, Bethany Stevens. She used to say that if it was a choice, I'd be even gayer. In fact, none of the components that we see up here is associated with a choice. As humans, we cannot choose how to feel. We are naturally diverse and we feel the way we feel. The only choice we have is whether or not we are true to our feelings. And unfortunately, for some of us, that inability to live authentically is a choice we must sometimes make. I want my students to know that we are socialized within a heteronormative culture, a culture that expects us to conform, and therefore we are sometimes forced to make choices about how we present ourselves. But despite rigid gender systems, despite homophobia, despite transphobia, we are queer. We are here, and we're not going anywhere. To quote the great RuPaul, you are born naked and the rest is drag. Yes, everybody is in drag. Whether you're a man or a woman, it just depends on how extreme you want to go. And in many ways, that playful observation captures something quite profound. The identities we inhibit are shaped by culture, language, expectations, and performance. They are lived, negotiated, and continually interpreted within our social worlds. Pedagogical practice in sexuality studies for me It's about rethinking those norms, and it's about celebrating our sexual diversity. It's about helping students recognize that the categories they inherit are not inevitable truths, but historical frameworks that can be questioned, expanded, and reimagined. And when students begin to see that complexity and diversity of our sexual bodies and identities, my greatest wish and hope is that something transformative happens, that curiosity replaces certainty, that empathy replaces judgments, and that humility replaces the assumption that there is not only one way to be human. And that, to me, is the promise of sexuality studies. It is not simply transmitting knowledge, but to cultivate a deeper respect for the complexity and recognition, affirmation, and celebration of our diverse sexual lives. Thank you so much for listening. Right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vallin, for that talk. I just want to point out that the 45 minutes she was speaking, she spoke about so many other people and shouted out so many other people, and what a beautiful quality that is about you. We have time for a couple questions, please. Raise your hand if you have them.
Oh, come on. Yes, thank you, Dr. Tevis.
Thank you, Dr. Valin.
Oh.
I apologize that I actually say your name wrong.
No, that is totally fine. There is no expectation to have sweet pronunciation.
Anyway, my question is, given the wide range of topics you discuss in your classes, which are challenging, and the large population of students you teach, could you give us an example of maybe like a particularly like challenging experience you might have had with a student, particularly in this political time, in our political times, and how you worked through it?
Thank you. I have to say that in my almost 20 years, which is nuts, it's almost 20 years in my teaching, very rarely have I had sort of combative questionings or discussion. And I think a lot of that is attributed to the climate that the students themselves bring to class. Like when they realize that, you know, the stuff that we learn up here, it's not just like stuff, that's someone's life, right? That's my identity, or that is like, I think it brings a sense of responsibility that I think most of the time students, they respect that, they appreciate that, they see that diversity. But I'll share a story that happened like the first semester I was teaching on my own. So I had just graduated with my master's in the spring, and I was teaching in the fall in McKenna Theater. The picture was there, like, and it was full. We had probably like 500 students in class. And Anne was not with me. She always used to sit on the chair next to me, just be like, yes, you're good. No, just, you know, reel it in, like, and sometimes help me out. But she wasn't there. I was on my own. And I invited a guest speaker who's gay. And I wanted her to sort of, you know, she had a really happy story. She had a really good coming out story. She was supported, and it was just a positive, right? And I thought that would be nice to hear, because so often queer stories are framed in the negative sort of basis, right? And so I thought it was great. So she came up, she gave her talk, you know, and she's like, oh, I you know, my parents kind of already knew, I never was accepted. They had a party for me, cake, blah, 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 everything was fine. And then it was time for questions, right? And so the mic went around the room. And I feel like I just told you that story, but like, yeah, I know. Now you have to hear it again. So it was this mic, right? Like a hand mic, right? That passed around the room. And then it came to this one student in the back who was clearly like not feeling it, right? Like the feet were like on front of the seat and it was like hanging down. And when the microphone came, like they took it like this. And they were like, I know, I was like, wow. And I was like, have you ever had sex with a dude? And people were just like, and I literally just wanted to go through this. Okay, and then she was like, no, I told you I'm lesbian, I never had any. How you know you don't like it, right? And people were like, oh my God. And I was, oh my God, I didn't, oh, right? And then she didn't really handle it very well, I thought, right? She actually responded back to him, be like, have you ever had sex with a guy? And people were like, ooh, you don't like it, right? And that was just not a great teaching moment, right? That is not what I want my classes to be. If we think about trauma and we think about what that means, particularly for our sexual lives, that can sometimes come out in ways that are not okay, right? And as instructors, I have a tremendous responsibility of facilitating and guiding to my best abilities to make sure that those moments don't happen, right? So, it was what it was. I was mortified, and I was like, mad at my friend after. I was like, why did you do that? And I was like, well, I wasn't going to take that. And I was like, this is education. We're not like on the street, I'm like, but anyway, the good part of the story is that a few semesters later, I get like a knock on my door. It's like, I was sitting in a scrub, I was like a low life instructor. I was like, in a scrub. But anyways, this student comes, knocks on my door and like, hey, Lisa, do you have a minute? And I was like, yes, hello. It's like, I don't know if you remember me. And I'm like, I do remember you, but please come on in. Anyway, so he came in and he sat down and he said, you know what, I want to apologize. I want to apologize to you for how I behaved in your class that day with that speaker. It was really hard for me to sit in a class like that and listen to this like amazing story coming out, like everything was great, she got a cake, everyone's happy, because that was never going to be my story, right? I wasn't out at that point. I knew that when I come out, like I'm going to lose my, my family. Like I was still living at home because they supported me throughout my my schooling, right? So I couldn't come out until my last semester. Now it was his last semester. He had come out to his parents about 3 months prior, and he hadn't spoken to his dad ever since. He had spoken to his mom recently only because they were on the same phone bill, right? So they had to do something payment-wise. But he was shunned, and he knew that that was going to be the case. He came from a very religious household. He lost his friends at church, and he had to find new ways, find new people. But he came back and he's like, I want to say sorry, because that class also made it so that I had the courage to live up to, like, I need to come out. And there are people, we're here, we're queer, but sometimes we just have to find, the people who's going to support us, right? So it has a good ending to that story, right? So, but that I think is one of the moments where I was just mortified, like, oh, right.
You've done so much in the past, so many different people, and just accomplished so much in life.
Mm-hmm.
What are you looking forward to doing for the upcoming years that we're continuing to teach, and what relationships are you looking forward to cultivating for the community?
If I can do what I do currently until I literally I can't do it anymore, then that's what I want to do. I want to be in the classroom. I want to be with students. That's my happiest days of the week is Tuesday, Thursday, 12 to 1:15. I get to be in the class, I get to be with students. Like, I'm way too excited, and they know that. They just, I talk a mile an hour, and I'm just like, oh my God, look at this, right? So like, if I can do what I do, then I'm happy. Yeah, that would be a blessing too. I don't take it for granted though, doing the work that I do in a place and time like this. I'm hoping we can say, yeah.
You spoke a little bit about your mentor,
Mm-hmm.
considering one of my mentors.
Mm.
What would be your hope for the students you taught, the students you will teach? Like, what is your legacy to them?
That's such big words. I don't really consider something like, you know what I mean? Like, but I think again, like, to go back to kind of the ending of my talk, if I can show students, right, that sexuality is diverse, that our sexual bodies are diverse, right? If they're on board with that, I feel like I did my job. For them to hop on the queer wagon, that's sometimes a big ask. That will be right. But I think at least if I can, have them walk away with a sense of, like, it's more to the binary, right? Then I think that I've done my job. Yeah, sorry.
You have students who being like a lot of very conservative, and being expressed in the household, within the education system in high schools, and it's going to keep getting more and more ingrained. How should we and how can we introduce sexuality studies within our workplace and students who are being taught in such progressive functions?
Yeah, that's
difficult questions.
No, but it's an important one, right? I think it goes back again to the intentionality and the responsibility that we have. Like for me in my work, like I'm, when I teach a class, right, students they chose me, right? Like they chose me, and they see my syllabus, they know my class. Like I don't, Like, and then I teach what I need to teach, right? But when I go out and work in communities, right? Like, I am not about like, you should learn this and this and this and that, right? Like, I want to meet people where they're at, right? I want them to, and if I'm invited and I just get like a little bit of my tips into the door, right? Then I feel again, like if I can meet people where they're at, then I'll do my job. The sort of experiences that we have and the walks of life that we come from, you don't change that overnight. You know what I'm saying? Like that is like very naive. I think a class can do that or like a talk can do that, right? So I think just, again, reading people and trying to meet them where they're at and offer bits and pieces of, let them then guide the questions. I think that will be probably what I would start. I know it's not super effective, right? Because sometimes we have a big task on our hands to like make sure that we can offer a different sort of perspective of future, but I think that takes time. Signal time is. Oh, sorry. No, I do.
I think one of the things I admire most about you is your ability to share about your personal life, your personal experiences when you're teaching. And I think that's a big way that your students respond to understanding that what they're learning applies to your life. How do you navigate sharing personal information, still being a professor and authority figure to students, and not having them take your experience as being own experience that they've learned?
Yeah. That's an excellent question, and I debate that a lot. Yeah, and I think I am extremely transparent again, right? Remember the first part was on transparency. Like, I think that's what I try to really make sure, particularly when I share bigger pieces of myself, right? And the reason why I started doing that was because I couldn't find speakers in the community that would do those things. And so that's why, like abortion, for example, I share my abortion story. And that's super controversial, right? Like, when I stand in front of a room and to hear a topic that is so controversial here in the US, I have to also, like in the US, this is controversial. In many other parts of the world, abortion is not controversial. It doesn't matter if you're super religious or on the far right, like it's not a controversial issue here. But I have a responsibility to make sure that the content that I present, right, is supposed to be sort of as objective as possible and reach as many people as possible in a way that they can see themselves and form their own opinions, right? My job is not to be like, this is what I did and this is how I live, so you should totally do what I did. Like, that is not what I'm about. So I'm always super mindful about when I share those things, but also thinking about the bigger picture. When it comes to abortion care, and particularly abortion itself, I think we have a tremendous amount of work to do into making sure that those conversations are more naturalized. To hear like an abortion story like mine, that is not like a very, exciting one in the sense that it was something complicated or something sort of life-threatening about it, right? But it was probably one of the best decisions that I have made for my body, right? Like if I go this way, then forever my life is going to be like this. Or if I do this, then forever my life is going to be that. That's not every day you're presented with that opportunity, right? And so like to be able to share a story then that, and the reasoning sort of behind and the procedure itself, like I think it's actually, if you balance it, I think that it's more important to share than not. But I prefaced it before, right? That this is my story, right? I am not sharing this because, you all should become pro-choice and like, you know what I mean? That if one is against abortion, still be against abortion, right? We should still be able to hear other perspectives and still hold on to our beliefs. So it is something that I, if I can have speakers, I think it's much more often appropriate to have speakers. But I think also it matters that we share stories, right? If you learn through stories and lived experience, I think that often weighs more in terms of that it matters than, when we just hear theories. Is that it? Okay, yeah.
Dr. Vallin teaches the most popular class in the college and teaches hundreds of students a semester, hundreds. And much to the envy of many of other departments, and I often hear other professors say, how can we do that? How can we get a Lisa? And I think this snapshot of what she does, how she thinks, how she embodies all this shows that cannot be replicated. You cannot just get a Lisa because you want students or you want funds for your department, right? She gives her whole heart and has such a pedagogical framework and way that you do things that connects community and all of us. We're just so lucky to have you in our department and in our community. Thank you so much for sharing that. Party. In the spirit of Lisa,